My name is Nicholas Panagiotou. I'm Associate Professor at School of Journalism and Mass Media Communications at Aristotle University of Greece, as well as President of DCN Global. DCN Global is a global organization with that deals mostly, and we work mostly around digital communication technologies, the emerging issues, challenges, and actually how to make best use of them. In today's webinar, which is part of a series of webinars that we have started from March 2020, and we still continue every month by highlighting or working in specific topics, such as the one that we are going to discuss today with our esteemed guest. The main topic is regarding disinformation, and most importantly, combating disinformation. And the discussion, it will be around the threats and solutions in the context of the Cambridge Disinformation Summit, that it will take place between 27 and 28 of July, both offline and online. We are honored to have both Emma Bryant, that is Associate Professor in university in Australia, as well as of Maribor, and as well as Alan Janko-Linzer, which is Professor of Financial Accounting and Co-Director of Cambridge Centre for Financial Reporting and Accountability at the King's College. Both of our esteemed professors have accepted the invitation in order actually to open up the discussion before a very important conference, such as the one that takes place in Cambridge, for which actually as DCN Global, we are participating by encouraging our members and distributing the relevant information. So I would like to go firstly with Professor Emma Bryant. The floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be with you here today. Thank you to everybody who's attending. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Emma. Now we'll pass the floor to Professor Alan Janko-Linzer.
Yeah, I'm equally grateful to be able to talk about this. I think this has been one of the most interesting projects I've started to try to do international and interdisciplinary collaboration on disinformation. And it's exciting that a 2-year lead up is finally getting, through the pandemic too, is finally giving me the opportunity to meet Emma in person tomorrow. We've talked a lot as an example, but to be able to have these kinds of discussions with people around the world who are trying to get their heads around how do we deal with disinformation and what are the implications for society? What are the interventions that might actually work? I think this is incredibly important work. So I'm honored to be here to talk to you. And I appreciate DCN Global participation with our summit as well.
Thank you. We couldn't, it is a very important summit. And of course, as the DCN, we're working a lot in a global scale on that topic. And for us, this summit represents a very good opportunity actually to be part of an initiative that it is related with disinformation. And I would like to start from the following question. The first one, there has been a lot of discussion around disinformation. It is actually a topic that it has been dominant from 2016 up until now. Why we keep discussing about disinformation after like almost 7 years when we initially started? Emma?
Why are we still talking about it?
Yes.
I mean, it just progress doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately. I wish it would happen a little more quickly. Unfortunately, I mean, there have been developments, important, changes taking place. We've seen some accountability when it comes to some actors. less when it comes to others. So, you know, there have been very slow snail's pace kind of developments, which, you know, take time. Government doesn't move quickly. And actually, that's kind of important because we don't want knee-jerk policy responses that have been poorly thought through in this kind of area. It's actually extremely dangerous if you think about this, you know, to put in place restrictions that haven't been thought through properly when it comes to propaganda, disinformation, and the, you know, potential speech issues that might be raised when it comes to censorship and so on. And we've seen controversy already around measures that have been put into place, as well as, you know, political kind of you know, efforts to undermine and distort the kinds of you know, responses that governments and civil society have tried to you know, use to combat disinformation. So it's a fraught kind of area and it's really important to make sure all developments are, you know, communicated well to the public, that we have a proper debate around introducing new policy, and that, you know, people can buy into the solutions that we, you know, implement. If you think about it, 2016 isn't really that long ago in terms of history and how quickly policy moves. So I would say that we're moving pretty quickly, really. Unfortunately, it might not be quick enough. Because it's certainly not keeping up with the changing pace of technology. In, you know, recent years, we've seen that, you know, just, you know, especially in the last year, we're seeing rapid developments when it comes to AI, you know, ChatGPT, and, you know, the deep fakes that now are becoming much more sophisticated. We're approaching the 2024 election, actually the United States, but also there are elections taking place all around the world, many elections, more than normal in 2024. And so in a year where there are, you know, so many really important elections taking place, we have a hell of a lot of unknowns when it comes to, you know, the technologies that will be deployed in that context and what we do about that. Some of the, you know, efforts that we've been putting into place have not necessarily worked, or, you know, have maybe not been well advised in how they've been implemented. So we need to think very carefully about maybe new ideas, and that's one of the reasons why this discussion is so important.
Thank you, Emma. Alan?
Yeah, I mean, Emma is definitively the expert in this particular space, but I'll note, based on some of the work that I've been reading and some of the conversations I've had, I think it's pretty clear disinformation's been with us throughout history. So it's by no means new. It certainly wasn't new in 2016. I think even I became more sensitive at that moment, I think perhaps because of some of the work that Emma had unraveled with the ability to weaponize, if you will, social media and the algorithms, the ability to broadcast globally, rapid pace, to micro-target specific types of individuals to get the right kind of emotional trigger in order to get them completely wrapped up in a particular messaging. And I think that also began this insidious nature, at least in the UK and the United States, from my perspective, of where now all of a sudden people who might otherwise be part of the governance around disinformation are now enraptured or captured in disinformation. And in some ways, they've become part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I don't know whether that's always been the case, because I haven't studied the history. We do have a historian who's going to open our summit who will discuss some of this in detail. But I think we're seeing now the manifestation of the ability to get intentionally harmful messaging out to incredibly, not only broad audiences, but very, very specifically chosen audiences, to get them to react in a specific way. And I don't see that improving. In fact, I would argue that some of that is actually arguably getting worse, in part because of the way in which the media organizations are owned, who owns them, why they own them, and things of that nature. So I think there's a whole lot of questions around media as well behind all this. And so the organism that actually is doing the dissemination, I don't know if that helps.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I think for me, 2016 popped on the radar, I think because of how social media, which prior to that, for me at least, I'll speak from my own experience, was, this allows me to keep track of all my friends who I might have lost touch with over 10 years. That's how I was using social media. Then it became something where it could be used to really manipulate the psychology of certain people. And Emma can speak a little bit more to that as well with some of the work she's done.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Alan. Emma?
Yeah, so I was just going to, sorry,
No.
say, so a few years ago, some of you might already know a little bit about my background, but I was involved in exposing the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So Cambridge Analytica, just to refresh your memories, was the consultants that worked on the Trump campaign and Brexit as well. And they were implicated in a scandal around misuse of Facebook data for driving fear-driven messaging. And they had sort of developed these techniques to that, they worked out that by targeting neurotic people, they were able to, create a greater impact for these conspiracy and fear-driven, very alarmist kind of fear messaging around the 2016 election. And this was all done with a personality test, an ordinary personality test that is used by all sorts of people. It was perfectly normal. And so I think one of the things that we didn't, a lot of people don't really appreciate is that, very, very kind of ordinary data models can be used for potentially nefarious purposes. There's no reason why we should ban a particular personality test that can be used for all sorts of perfectly normal purposes. And one of the problems is that, the focus on the platforms has meant that, the regulation has been taking place around, how can we change the platforms? And actually, some of the abuses are happening on other levels of this infrastructure. So, for instance, with Cambridge Analytica, the platform wouldn't necessarily know the way that they were treating that data, the type of list, for instance, of audiences that they had uploaded. Facebook wouldn't necessarily know that this was a list of neurotic people that were being used for targeting. But then, of course, the coming together of these two different types of industries, so the platforms that have their functions, as well as the, influence firms like Cambridge Analytica, essentially, we need to understand both and the way that they connect, because once Cambridge Analytica, put their list of audiences on Facebook in order to, use the targeting features, they would upload the list, their target audience list. Then the platform actually, goes and finds lookalike audiences. So audiences that look like this group of people who, are very prone to anxiety, and are then finding more of those people to target with this extreme messaging. Now, whether or not, the impact that has is enough to sway a whole election or not is something that's unknowable, unfortunately. We don't really have the ability to test this kind of thing. But what we do know is that it's likely to have an effect. And the internal evaluations of the company were showing that this certainly was making a difference. And when it comes to a swing state and a very narrow margin on a really important election, these things may well make all the difference. And so I personally think that it's really important that we start to think about this in terms of all of these different structures and how they work together. At the moment, a lot of the time, the focus is on one group of actors, one media form or media organization. And it's actually a very complex thing to try to think about how these all fit together. And it requires, from a researcher point of view, a new approach to kind of doing research as well. It's not enough to simply be looking at tweets, for instance, even though all academics are very unhappy at the moment about the fact that the API, the platforms are stopping access to Twitter and or X as it's now being called, the posts to enable their research. Well, we have to be thinking about not just what's on the platform, but how it links to all these other organizations and the ways in which an actor seeking to influence uses the affordances of all of these different industries. Some of those industries might be ideological. They might be, companies like Cambridge Analytica. They might be profit oriented. So they're not necessarily looking for to spread a particular ideology or to serve a political purpose. But ad tech, for instance, actually it just all wants to make money. There's clickbait farms and so on. And all of these actors want to make money, but they're agnostic to how. The platforms, however, are designed in such a way that they are monetizing the attention economy. So the things that make us likely to put our click on things and share things and interact with things are things like fear. That's why Cambridge Analytica was so successful with its methodology, was because it realized that it could isolate who is fearful. Who are the people who are most likely to be driven by fear, and let's feed them more of this. So the whole platforms are designed around this kind of mechanism and psychology. And it's incredibly harmful to us as human beings to be constantly being stimulated in this kind of way. We don't really know the long-term impacts of this.
But from the other point of view, are extremely helpful, as Alan mentioned before, in connecting us with people that it has been years since we saw them. But I think that Emma pinpointed, Alan, something that it is at the core of this discussion, accountability. So we have to actually to distinguish between the disinformation or actually exploitation for commercial purposes of personal data usage, and also from the other point of view, the exploitation that takes place in order to spread disinformation for political purposes. Do you think that in this case accountability is part of the solution? And if yes, what is the form through which it can take place? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I am a huge advocate for accountability, particularly when it comes to information. Our entire system around financial communication has accountability baked into it. So we recognize, and this is where the whole thing started, we recognize there are incentives to lie in financial reporting. There's all kinds of financial gain if you lie, and you can lie successfully. You can either play stock market or get different compensation structures out of your board, things of that nature. So there are many people who are vulnerable in a financial context. And so we've baked in a tremendous amount of accountability with respect to financial reporting standards, where we have very specific ways in which we communicate. And then we have audits, and we have enforcement and regulation. We have to have insurance. I mean, there's a very, very detailed infrastructure we have around accountability, and the accountability inherently comes from after the fact enforcement. So if you're flagged potentially for fraud, then a government regulator or a shareholder who can show that they were harmed by your fraud can come after you and sue you and claim damages, get financial damages at a minimum, and in very rare cases, in some jurisdictions, there's opportunity for prison or at least conviction of a crime. Moving into the more general space, I mean, one of the reasons I started the summit was I didn't understand why we don't have some similar infrastructure in the other social contexts where the analog is reasonably similar. We have all kinds of ways in which one can manipulate and exploit people with intentionally false or misleading information. And, where is the accountability and to whom? We see this in certain jurisdictions around defamation. The most recent big case, I believe, was Fox News was sued by at least one of the voting booth or voting technology companies. I think they have several defamation cases, and those are almost never winnable. They're very, very hard cases under United States law to win. But there's accountability from arguably the direct source of the disinformation. Where it becomes gray, though, is the media, the dissemination channel accountability, and that's difficult. So hypothetically, if Emma intentionally places misleading information that harms me into a tweet, and I can show that it was intentional, then depending on the jurisdiction, I could probably pursue some sort of accountability in some context. We see this a little bit too, where people are doxxed, I guess is a term, to out, and then maybe they're fired because their employer doesn't align with what they're doing. In other cases, there's direct legal action. But the question is, what's the accountability around Twitter, or what's the accountability around Facebook? And that is a challenge. And this is one of the reasons why we brought in security. Well, we didn't get our securities law professor, but I have a constitutional law professor and some policymakers in the summit to help me understand, like, where's the law around this in different jurisdictions? And is there a way in which we can say, hey, social media platform X, you are inherently accountable because you could have taken some element of care to understand that this is clearly falsifiably wrong. It's unambiguously wrong, or it's very high probability that it's wrong, yet not only did you share it to a harmed party, but also you perhaps amplified its reach. And so this gets into accountability. And I to your question of what accountability could look like, I sense, transparency is one of the biggest elements of accountability, even more so than, arguably more so than, criminal punishment, or I guess it's in some ways a necessary condition in order to get to accountability. So one of my core advocacy elements when I'm talking about accountability is inherently transparency. So in my mind, the path to accountability is by mandating more disclosure about processes. I would like to know, what is it? What do you do with this information? Is there a vetting algorithm? Without judgment, like, do you vet this for its credibility? Yes or no? How do you vet it for its credibility? What's that algorithm? Who's doing it? How do you trust that system? Do you then amplify it? Do you descale it and bring it down in its volume? What does that look like too? And once we have transparency around that, then one can think a little bit more about how to structure safer systems. It also gets into issues around free speech, and there's a whole debate about whether we should be doing this kind of thing. But, I don't have a lot of people fighting back on, quote, free speech when we all agree that financial fraud is wrong. So Bernie Madoff should not be allowed to blatantly lie about the value of the investment portfolio he's presumably managing. So, him being able to blatantly lie to investors is free speech inherently. He should be able to say whatever he wants, but without accountability, I find that incredibly dangerous. And we seem comfortable in that context to say, you can't just say anything. it has to be accountable. So in some ways you can say it, but then we're going to vet it, and then we're going to hold you accountable if it's a lie and if it's harmed people. So to me, this gets into this notion about free speech and free speech rights, and where's the boundary on free speech, and do we allow the speech? Maybe, because I'm not necessarily one for deplatforming. I'm certainly not a censorship type person. In fact, I love the ability to speak freely, and I'm all for academic freedom and other things. But I do think the ability to challenge that speech, the ability to say, hey, we believe that you're harming people with that speech, the ability to probe the genesis of the citations or the support behind the speech. So Emma, you said X. Can you show me your process by which you arrived at X? I want to have accountability around that process. I want to know, how did you arrive at that is what you communicated? Did you evaluate whether there was any harm done prior? Did you consider that? Things like that. So that's where I see accountability. And I think transparency into processes is a massively powerful accountability tool. And we are advocates for transparency.
Yes, I thoroughly agree with that. I mean, I know this isn't really quite what you mean, but it's worth raising also the situation in the UK when it comes to defamation and libel laws. You know, these are very different from in the United States and have had a chilling effect upon journalism. So we certainly don't want to be going that far. And it looks good that, you know, there are measures being taken in relation to, you know, making sure that those issues are addressed in the UK context. But definitely there needs to be accountability and a lot more transparency over, especially the platforms. Like, these are bigger than governments, you know, this is huge companies, corporations that, you know, that are black boxes to us. You know, we have absolutely no ability to FOIA like you would a government, and yet these companies are forming our civic infrastructure. We do everything through these companies. X or Twitter are now saying, you know, they're going to be the everything app, with you doing your banking through the app and all this. So why do we not have any ability to seek information from Twitter or any other companies like this, you know, Meta or Google? You know, we should be able to FOIA them, or some kind of process that is similar to freedom of information request access for such huge companies that, you know, form the infrastructure of our society now. You know, I don't think that's an exaggeration. We need to stop thinking of these companies as media and start to think of them more as our infrastructure for our lives, for everything that happens in our society. So it's incredibly important that we have access to information. And I think it shouldn't be just about the tweets or, you know, certain transparency data that, you know, a lot of researchers have been requesting, which is important. It needs to go beyond this. So we need to have sight of decision making, for instance. We need to be able to say, hey, we want to know how you developed that policy, or why you took those actions, why this algorithm is the way it is, and so on, and how this is producing this effect in our society, what effects your algorithms are having. So we need to be able to, you know, require them to produce that kind of information. And I think that's actually way more important than, you know, the kind of interventions that have been more controversial about, you know, pulling down content or, you know, acting upon content. Actually having an ability to show what the platforms are doing and potentially have that public discussion is really important, especially around data and the fact that, you know, these platforms are have an asymmetry. You know, we don't know enough about them, and that gives them huge power over our lives.
What's kind of funny as a super quick follow-up is that if X does in fact progress in its platform as envisioned, it may ironically fall under some transparency laws under banking, which is kind of interesting to see as an evolution.
I'm sure Elon Musk hasn't thought that far.
So you touched a very important, which is actually, yeah, but I think, and this has the form of question to you, how can public bodies exert this kind of, let's say, accountable measures or implement accountable measures, especially when they either lack the capacity, as we have seen with the subprime loans in 2009, or as we have seen during the public hearing, sometimes they do lack the proper understanding of the algorithm or the digital technologies. Do you think that both countries or international organizations lack the capacity to hold the social platforms accountable? And if they do, how they can do that? Thank you.
I can have a few thoughts, and then Emma can piggyback with her experience. One of the reasons why I convened the Disinformation Summit is because I don't know that there is a singular source of expertise. And I think as a collective international interdisciplinary body within our cohort, we can develop that expertise. So I have a problem, and I've had conversations with regulators from country X, I'll name it country X, about this notion, for example, of the word foreign, or this notion of, that we're going to have governmental regulation in country X that might vary from governmental regulation in country Y. And that gets into some of your discussion about country X might have more sophisticated people or more money or whatever. At the end of the day, I think it's all systemic, it's all international. And I think if it were in some ways open sourced, then people like the colleagues I know who are doing academic research and journalists who are doing very deep inquiry, I think they're arguably some of your most interesting, enforcement agents, for lack of a better term. So to me, again, it comes back to transparency. One of the reasons I joined a recent request from the Minderoo Center, which is the center here at Cambridge, based in Cambridge primarily, was to get to transparent data so that we could help with understanding what's going on in these platforms. And I think to me, I think we need to stop thinking this in terms of country X and country boundaries and think of us as a systemic global problem, and that requires systemic global community. Perhaps maybe the best analogy is Bellingcat or some of these other open source organizations that are truly global and collaborative. That's just one way of thinking about it.
Thank you, Alan. Emma?
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add to that. I want to say, I think a lot of those kinds of national boundaries issues arise in relation to the United States. So in discussions that I've had there, I would say that, there's a lot of concern around, the foreign propaganda targeting citizens. And it's very difficult to do things about domestic citizens producing propaganda and misleading and disinformation that flows within the boundaries of the United States. And the trouble is that it's very difficult to discern whether something is foreign or whether it's not. And, obviously foreign actors are very keen to look like they're domestic actors. And so this raises an awful lot of problems. And I would say one of the ways around that has been to treat all of these kinds of communications as the same, because they all have a similar effect, or this is the argument. I actually disagree with this myself, because I think that there is a massive difference between the strategy behind and intent of the propaganda produced by the IRA, Russian IRA, for example, and the ways in which it manipulates it, which fit into a foreign policy and international, conflict environment that needs to be all taken into account when we evaluate the kind of operation that is running. It's a military campaign, essentially. This is an intelligence operation. There's a big difference between that and domestic actors, which, while we might disagree with their views and think they're awful, are, not necessarily launching an intelligence operation against the United States. I mean, they might be, but, generally speaking, we're talking about political debates internally. Something can look exactly the same, in terms of its output coming from the IRA, but the purpose is entirely different to, an ordinary group within that country producing that kind of output. So I do think these things have to be treated differently. I don't know how you identify when something has come from abroad and when it's not. This is a challenge that, the platforms struggle with as well. So they do, however, have more data than researchers do. And they have been reluctant to actually make that data available. So I would say that, authorities, if they want to intervene, they need access to that data. And at the moment, if you look at the discussion that's going on in the United States around the, Congress, it's actually, they are basically stopping the United States government from being able to access information from the platforms and to, make recommendations for the platforms to potentially consider their policy in relation to certain posts. This barrier has been put up around, the discussion around whether, it's constitutional for government to even have those discussions with platforms. So I think that's a real problem, because I think we actually need to have an open discussion about what is the responsible role of government. And that's not just in the United States, but also in the UK and in other countries. I think it's actually a really important issue. Personally, I'm very concerned about, domestic interventions by governments. But that doesn't mean that I think that it's inappropriate for them to ask for certain information from platforms about, whether campaigns are foreign or domestic, in order to potentially, act on an international stage if we're under attack and we are getting, foreign influence operations targeting us. Because, by the way, there is a difference between a domestic discussion that's taking place around an election and a foreign entity that is trying to influence that. So I think we need to be really careful about having these discussions around what is that appropriate role for governments, because those are being manipulated themselves in order to enable disinformation.
I agree. And I think that among other things, an important element, it is what it has been mentioned before, and I didn't want to interrupt you actually. What we have seen in the recent years, and we have seen an erosion of disinformation that I suggest that it is linked with the erosion of trust. Alan mentioned about actually credibility, and I linked it with the erosion of trust towards institutions that we more and more record in the Western societies. Alan?
I think that's intentional. So I believe part of the, and it's going to tie back to what I heard from Emma, and I'll come back to this. I think some of the incentives, I think the way to label it in my mind is based on what we perceive are the incentives behind the messaging, and not label it as foreign necessarily or domestic, but as a particular incentive for particular benefit or objective. And Emma gave a context, for example, about a war. To perpetrate a war might be considered foreign. Another one might be to undermine the faith in the institutions in order to perpetuate a grift. If I'm going to steal from the government treasury, which we know happens in many countries, if I'm going to do self-dealing, where I'm going to give myself money, I'm going to hand out contracts with taxpayers' money to my friends, if I'm going to align with a foreign actor because they can help destabilize so that I can obtain power in a government. So in other words, to support an election outcome, perhaps, then I'm now aligned on incentives, and it's no longer foreign. It's sort of a collaborative in a way. It's almost like a organized criminal enterprise in some way of thinking about it from a business perspective. So I go to that perspective, and I think the undermining in trust is in some cases deliberate. I have seen, to me, very strong evidence that that's the intention of it. I think you see this, for example, right now in the United States with undermining the perception of independence of the enforcement agencies. We see attacks against the U.S. Federal enforcement system, the Department of Justice, and the Bureau of Investigation as classic examples. And typically, if you look at the evidence, it seems as those who are under investigation are those trying to undermine the credibility of those who are being investigated. I could see an analog to that as well, perhaps in my field. If I know that my auditor is going to say something negative about my financial health of my enterprise, I may have some reason or some incentive now to undermine their perceived credibility in the market. So I think the destabilizing part is intentional. I suspect that that was behind some of the actions for some of the things that Emma has actually studied back in the day. With respect to that, I think, this is outside my space, but I think a lot of this goes into some of the webinars that we have done. We spoke, for example, with a senior partner at PwC who does consulting with corporations around trying to regain trust when trust has been challenged. You can imagine, for example, banks. Silicon Valley Bank is one example where trust has eroded. Now, one could argue that it was well earned, that the trust was eroded. But there are ways in which, if I know that Emma is deliberately trying to undermine my reputation, then there are ways, and some of the psychologists we're interviewing at the summit can speak more to this than I am, about how one can get in front of that messaging and try to retain the trust and the perception on that too.
Why me, Alan?
It's hypothetical, Emma.
I feel a little bit
It's
picked on
because you're here and we know each other. It's hypothetical. But I always do well, this is by the way, when I'm in the classroom, I always have students run hypotheticals. They don't.
I'm the bad guy, though. I mean.
So, in any case, I think to your question, though, I think we have to recognize collectively that there are people who, let me say it differently. There are reasons why we might not want to trust our infrastructure anymore that are natural. So in some cases, there's either malaise or stagnancy, or because we have people who are hypocritical. We see that in the UK with lockdown. You have to lock down for pandemic, but I'm going to go party with my friends. In those situations, it's well earned. The hypocrisy of that, to me, has well earned a lack of trust in the infrastructure. But I think there are cases where we also have to have acknowledgement that some people are trying to get us to not trust the system, and we have to consider why and think in terms of communicating that we should actually trust the system, and also a way of being aware that our entire infrastructure relies on trust. And so we have to have the conversations of, are we earning trust? If not, then how can we regain it? And a lot of that comes from both communication, but also on actually delivering on what we promise. I mean, if I, as a politician, are going to tell you that I'm going to deliver on something, and you're now putting your money and your family's lives in my hands to do so, then I have some obligation ethically to do so and deliver on it.
Yes.
So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Emma.
If I may, I think it's so much easier to actually secure trust and keep that trust than it is to rebuild trust once it's been damaged. And I think this is one thing that governments and politicians really do not comprehend, is just how easy it is to erode trust and to even by miscommunication. It doesn't even have to be that they do something really bad, but the effort should be upon, communicating effectively in a way that, is truthful, but, is also securing trust, so that we actually we know what we're dealing with here. A lot of the trouble has been, if you look at the Iraq War, for instance, the legacy of that, we are still feeling today when it comes to trust and the declining trust in what are necessarily secretive systems. So national security and the decisions that go into making, choices around conflicts and the ways in which conflicts unfold. Basically, there's a limit to how much we can know, and when you damage trust in the way that our governments have in the past, it's very difficult to repair that. Years later, the Russians are still exploiting it, and we have created that environment. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to then rebuild and to secure people's trust again once it's been damaged. So I think if you look at anything that is being done poorly to actually erode trust, just addressing those issues is paramount. I think people think that it's not really that big a deal, that, when governments miscommunicate things, it happens all the time. Actually, it's really important because, that damaged trust already exists, and you're just making it worse. And it's a lot harder to rebuild that once it's already been done. And I've seen, so many efforts to try to, address these problems that are not undermined by, the process, but actually have just, looked like they are a terrible propaganda operation because of the fact that they haven't been communicated well. And I think that's such a shame when that happens. And it really is important to actually show people what you're doing and be transparent and clear about it.
Let me add to quickly, because we teach trust as a concept in our program here in the Executive Masters of Accounting program, in our interpersonal dynamics course, using Charles Feltham's book called The Thin Book of Trust. There are 4 elements to trust. And when I communicate what the 4 elements are, I want you to consider any government around the world, whether they meet all 4. Because in order to have trust, you must meet sincerity, care, reliability, and competency. Tell me any government that meets all 4 of those. And it's very difficult because we often, we see all kinds of governments where we fail on competency, we fail repeatedly on reliability, and then the sincerity and care is often for an elected official or an authoritarian figure. They're lacking inherently, so it's a real problem.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that you can make substantial progress, but I think you're right. It has to be an everyday, this is the top of your agenda kind of focus. And I don't think it's the last thing that they are thinking about when they are governing, unfortunately, it seems like to me. So I think this needs to be the number one thing, because actually, if you have this kind of erosion of trust, it's so easy to exploit divisions. It is so easy to, destroy, security in a state through these kinds of mechanisms, and it makes it very difficult to act as a government. So it should be the number one priority.
I fully believe on that, and part of my research, actually, most of my research, it is related on building or addressing issues of trust as a mean to combat disinformation. But anyhow, I think that this webinar couldn't refer to Cambridge Disinformation Summit without actually saying a few things what our audience would what will follow tomorrow online or in person. So Alan and Emma, please go ahead.
Yeah, so this was a process where we built.
And in order to
Emma,
speak in a political way, just give me 2 reasons why I should follow the webinar.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think fundamentally the approach was, what were the questions that I was having with respect to the world that I'm observing? That's kind of where we went, and a lot of the questions are baked into, how do we do intervention on some of the societal problems that we've discussed already. So some of the things, first of all, was, what are the societal problems? We tee up a discussion with people who are in the field dealing with global problems, whether it's health related or environmental implications of disinformation. But then we move quickly into some discussions around, like, literally one of the discussions was, where's the line on platform accountability? We've had the discussion in this context. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I think we should have some accountability. I have some ideas, as I noted, about what that might look like, but I don't know where we should draw the line. I don't know how we could do it. I don't know how we could do it when we impose free speech rights and some of the digital services rights and things of that nature. And it also gets into corporate rights, even, because these are businesses we're imposing will on, and they're multi-jurisdictional. So that was one of the more interesting topics. We also get into, Emma's going to discuss one of the core things that I think we tend not to really address explicitly, but I think is one of the most critical, which is, who's profiting? What's the payoff to this? Like, why am I lying to you? How do I make money from this? How do I exploit you? It doesn't have to be money. It could be social, psychological benefit. Some people manipulate because they want to have physical access to you, or they want to violate your physical boundaries. So there's all kinds of reasons why we might do it, but where's the profiteering? And so Emma's going to lead that panel and get on that panel. We also have discussion around strategies to mitigate. I call them interventions now. I like to think of them as interventions, and there are multiple types. One of them is media literacy. We have some experts from Finland, for example, who developed media literacy for grade school education, which has some promise, and things like that. So, I mean, these are the kinds of topics where, and one of the more important things is conspiratorial beliefs, like entrenched beliefs. What I found, which was stunning, I am inherently very skeptical. And when people deliver information to me, I tend not to trust it by default. And I don't understand why people don't do that. I find it just crazy in my mind. I shouldn't use the word crazy. It's just who they are, but I don't understand it. So the people who simply believe somebody because of it's person X, maybe it's a movie star or a musician or a populist politician or something, they just believe. And I find that interesting. And so what we're trying to understand is why do they follow this? Why do they? And so we have some very fascinating speakers, including Sandra van der Linden, who's a social psychologist here at Cambridge, Diane Benscoter, who was in a cult, and she wrote a book on cults and why she got into a cult and how she ended up becoming a cult deprogrammer. I don't know if that's the proper term anymore. And then Sunita Shah, who is a colleague of mine at Cornell University, who's also a social psychologist, who's done a lot of research in this area. So I find that fascinating because I don't understand it, but yet they're everywhere. They're in every society. And these are people who are being exploited, and they're unaware they're being exploited. In many cases, they're willingly being exploited. And I just need to understand that. So that was one of why I reached out to some of the colleagues who are joining us. And we're very fortunate that they're coming in to discuss this, because it's so different from the people I work with in my field.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that I've felt is so valuable about this event, is that, I'm getting to meet people from so many different disciplines. It is really very broad, and it is so unusual as well to have an event about disinformation that is, being put forward in a, business school, in a, accounting and all these other perspectives. Accountability is so incredibly important. Why are we not having these, collaborative approaches all the time? Actually, it's about, the responsibilities of organizations, of industries. And we should have been having this discussion for the last, 5, 7, however many years it is now, and 10 years longer. Because, actually it's going to take all of us to sort this out. I have my expertise, but, that is going to be of such, exponential value when I am working with all of these other collaborators on developing, strategies together. What I talked about earlier, about the complexity of understanding the way that these organizations work together, and the affordances and the opportunities and the risks associated with that. If we are going to be, using civil society and academics and journalists in order to, make this transparent and understand and interpret it, it's going to take all of us working together. So I'm excited about, what the next 2 days has to offer. And thank you to Alan for, organizing what has been, I know is going to be a fantastic event. I'm very excited. And thank you for bringing me here.
I
has
think
been a
that
really interesting discussion as well. Thank you.
I think that was actually among the best things, why someone should follow the event that starts tomorrow. We as DCN Global, we will follow it up very closely, since it is a very interesting event with great speakers. So we urge the participants here to take part of it. As an ex-Chevening scholar, and as someone that spent some time in UK, learned that you cannot hold an event and not being accurate in time. So actually we have reached our time limits, and please share your thoughts through this evaluation form that we shared with you through the chat room. So because we are more than grateful if you can share your thoughts and actually tell us a few things about how you found today's webinar. I would like to thank both Emma and Alan for being with us despite being jet lagged and actually just before one major event. I would like to wish you best success for tomorrow's event, and also looking forward to have another post-event discussion on September, because August is, as I have learned as a South European person, it is the month of holidays. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for everyone attending.